question is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise also to speak on the appropriations bills in front of us. And can I start by commending the member for Higgins for that fine contribution, in particular for pointing out some of the myths in relation to Labor's claims that they saved the world through their stimulus package in 2008-2009. Mr Deputy Speaker, it was Prime Minister Paul Keating who said that when you change the government, you change the nation. And it was an apt comment, and I believe it is true. Because when you reflect back on 1996, with the Howard government coming into being, it did change the nation. It brought a period of prosperity, fantastic relationships with our neighbours and with our allies, and incredible wealth creation for families across the country. Similarly, in 2007, when the Labor government was elected, the nation changed. Now, I would argue, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the changes weren't always for the better when the Labor governments came in, and indeed they re-regulated the economy, and we saw waste and debt like we have never seen before in the history of this country. But we are now almost 6 months into the Abbott government. And like with the election of other governments in 1996 and 2007 and the governments prior to that, the nation is changing and will change from this government. And I'd like to use this appropriations debate to outline how the nation is changing for the better already, and to specifically report back to my electorate through this parliament on the progress against the key commitments that we made before the last election to improve this nation. And of course our starting points, Mr Deputy Speaker, has been to fix Labor's messes. Because unlike the incoming Labor government in 2007, we did not inherit a strong economy and $20 billion budget surpluses. Rather, we inherited what can only be described as a mess. And the clearest example of this was in border protection, where over the period of the Labor government, over 55,000 people arrived by boat, at least 1,200 people died at sea, and people waiting in refugee camps were denied places in Australia. As former Prime Minister John Howard has noted, it was probably Labor's greatest failing, because they alone were the author of the crisis through their deliberate dismantling of the system which was painstakingly put in place under the Howard government. And that system ensured that almost no boats were arriving, that there were no children in detention, and that in fact there were only 4 adults in detention in 2007. And it also ensured that our entire refugee intake, which is about 13,500 people per annum, was taken from the United Nations refugee camps, which I believe is the right process in terms of taking refugees into this country. But having created the crisis, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor then used every justification imaginable as why they could not fix the crisis. But the simple reason why they couldn't fix it is because they lacked resolve. And Mr Deputy Speaker, we have no such lacking of resolve in addressing this crisis. Operation Sovereign Borders commenced 11 days after the election. And while it is too easy to say that the boats have stopped, they are certainly stopping. Because over the last 3 months we have seen not a single boat arrive, whereas the 3 months in the same period of the previous year we saw hundreds of boats arrive, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, the measures that we have put in place and which Scott Morrison continues to put in place under the government, leading the government in this area, are not easy measures. Tough decisions had to be made in order to put those measures in place. But I strongly believe that our policy is fair towards genuine refugees and is saving hundreds of lives at sea. Importantly, when borders are secure, there is stronger confidence from the public in our overall immigration program. And that overall immigration program has underpinned the progress of our great multicultural cities like Melbourne, where I live. Mr Deputy Speaker, repairing the economy has been the next great task of this government. Having inherited a $20 billion surplus, Labor then recorded the 4 biggest budget deficits in the history of this country. Now, we have made this point before, but it is worth stopping and reflecting on that. The 4 biggest budget deficits in the history of this country were recorded under the Labor government, despite inheriting a $20 billion surplus in 2007. And if settings do not change, there will be another $123 billion worth of deficits over the next 4 years, and our gross debt will go up to $667 billion. They're extraordinary numbers. Extraordinary numbers, Mr Deputy Speaker, but this is Labor's legacy that they have left the nation and that they have left this government, the Howard government, the Abbott government, to deal with. They borrowed from the future to pay for things like pink bats, as the member for Higgins pointed out, for overpriced school halls, for set-top boxes, for $900 cheques to dead people, and for other things which can only be described as wasteful spending. And we should never forget that wasteful spending and never forget who undertook it, why it was undertaken, and no government should repeat such wasteful spending again, and certainly this government will not do so. As well as the budgetary situation, the macroeconomy was seriously weakened over the last 6 years. For the first time, the government re-regulated the Australian economy in industrial relations, in environmental regulations and other red tape. 20,000 new regulations were put in place. Taxes, including, of course, the job-destroying carbon tax and the mining tax, were put in place, and investment decisions by companies were postponed or they were rejected. Multi-factor productivity declined by 4% per annum since 2007, with only the record high terms of trade causing us not to have a weakening of living standards. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, our approach to these very difficult financial and economic challenges is based on some fundamental principles. And the Prime Minister very neatly summarised some of these principles at the World Economic Forum in Davos just recently. And he said in 4 pithy principles. First, you can't spend what you haven't got. That's right. Second, no country has ever taxed or subsidised its way to prosperity. Third, you don't address debt and deficit with more debt and deficit. And fourth, profit is not a dirty word, because success in business is something to be proud of. Now, these principles, Mr Deputy Speaker, are very different principles than that which operated under the Labor government, and we are putting these principles into action, into practical steps which we are taking. And I'll provide some examples to the House here. Perhaps one of the most substantial examples of that is the $400 billion worth of projects that were in Labor's too hard basket, but which have now been approved by Environmental Minister Greg Hunt. $400 billion worth of projects. You think about what employment that creates, what wealth that creates, what money into the country that brings, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I commend the Environment Minister for making those decisions, a man who is passionate about the environment, but a person who also knows we must have a strong economy in order to sustain job creation and wealth creation. The Trade and Investment Minister, Andrew Robb, has already concluded a free trade agreement with Korea. Now, that is worth $5 billion to the economy. Likewise, he's working on free trade agreements with Japan and China. Now, all 3 of those free trade agreements were stagnant, they were stalled, they were on hold over the last 6 years. They didn't go anywhere. But already, under the principles which the Prime Minister has articulated, under the Open for Business principle, a $5 billion free trade agreement has been signed with Korea, and we're hoping that we'll have free trade agreements with Japan and with China signed very soon in the near future. And when that occurs, it will mean that we have free trade agreements with our four largest trading partners. And what that means is golden opportunities for our exporters. And it also means cheaper imports as well. Mr Deputy Speaker, billions of dollars worth of wealth creation from those free trade agreements, and again I commend the Trade and Investment Minister Andrew Robb for leading those free trade agreements. On the tax front, we have scrapped dozens of Labor's announced and budgeted but not enacted tax changes. And of course this included their $1.8 billion hit on the novated car lease industry. The carbon tax and the mining tax repeal legislation, as everybody knows, has been introduced into this House. It has passed this House, but is now stuck in the Senate. If Labor stops blocking those pieces of repeal legislation, then families will be, on average, $550 per annum better off. $550 per annum better off. But Labor right now is in the Senate blocking those pieces of legislation which would see the abolition of the carbon tax and the mining tax. And of course, when we abolish those, that will also lift the burden on businesses as well. We will cut the company tax by 1.5%. We will remove over $1 billion in red and green tape so that our businesses can focus on improving their performance, not on form filling. To repair the budget, we've put into this parliament already $20 billion worth of savings, and we have a full commission of audit which is identifying waste, inefficiency and duplication between layers of government. We've got the East-West Link project about to begin construction, and we have other major infrastructure projects in every state across the country that will soon begin. All of these measures, Mr Deputy Speaker, are designed to build business confidence, to encourage investment, to allow businesses to be more profitable, which ultimately allows jobs growth and salary growth. And there are many businesses which are struggling, including in my electorate, Mr Deputy Speaker. And when those businesses struggle, jobs are lost. And it's ultimately only profitable businesses that creates wealth for this nation. And when we have profitable businesses, we have job creation, Mr Deputy Speaker. And that is our overall objective. We want to support these businesses, and the best way to do this is to make the business environment as attractive as possible. And so our measures are designed to do this, to lower taxes, to have less regulation, to have better infrastructure, to have lower energy prices, to have a more flexible industrial relations system and consistency of decision-making. And we are seeing this approach already translating. We see business confidence is higher. We see in the papers today that both private sector housing and non-residential building approvals have risen by more than 20%, surpassing levels from before the GFC for the first time. We still have record shipments of coal and iron ore, returning the trade account to a surplus. And I regularly hear from companies that investments which were put on hold pre-election are now being made, that decisions are being made. All of those are terrific signs. So there is great room for optimism, Mr Deputy Speaker, despite the difficulties that some of the older industrial companies are having. Stopping the boats, ending the waste, getting the budget under control and growing the economy more strongly again and reducing cost of living were the core commitments we made during the election, and we are delivering upon them. Of course, we're strongly moving forward on our social policy agenda as well, including giving unprecedented attention to our nation's greatest social policy challenge, the plight of many Indigenous Australians. And there will be other opportunities for me to outline in greater detail the progress on this front. Mr Deputy Speaker, there are so many challenges and so much to do as a nation. As a government, we cannot fix Labor's messes overnight. We can't turn the economy around on a dime. But we are off to a good start and the pieces are being put in place. And in time, the government's finances will be restored. The economy will be growing strongly again, and there'll be more opportunities for all Australian and greater wealth creation. And Paul Keating may not like it, but the nation is changing, and it is changing for the better. and we ask the Labor government to support this program so that get on board, so that wealth creation, job creation, business investment can occur.
Thank the Parliamentary Secretary.